All right, and we're going to get started. And just to begin things, the title of today's webinar, which is part 2 of this 3-part webinar series, is entitled Practical Tips to Prevent Board of Pharmacy Discipline. And this is a continuation from part 1. And just as a brief reminder, part 1 had focused on the idea of common actions by boards of pharmacy. And as we transition from common actions, we want to talk about some practical steps or tips that we can take to prevent Board of Pharmacy action or discipline from taking place in the first instance. And just a very brief reminder, as I understand that we have some participants here who were not able to join the first webinar, Frier Levitt, as well as myself, we are a boutique healthcare and life sciences law firm that focuses exclusively in the areas of healthcare and life sciences. And so in that regard, our practice focuses heavily on representing pharmacies, pharmacists, and other licensees working in that space. Now, a couple of the things for the focus today and the different goals for part 2. We want to talk heavily about why prevention is crucial for licensees. We want to talk about some practical guidance on cultivating a positive relationship with State Board of Pharmacies. I would also describe a relationship of an interactive relationship with them. And then the significance of effective communication with state boards of pharmacy and why communication is so important. Now, before we dive into the substance of part 2, I do just want to have a couple of reminders that I think help to set the stage for why we're going to talk about, 1, the importance of prevention, but 2, the importance and significance of communication. And I think that to understand why we want to encourage communication and interaction with your board of pharmacy, you got to really remind yourself of what we discussed in part 1 of the webinar, which is that a board of pharmacy is an administrative agency. It is a state government agency. And the reason why this is important to keep in mind is because, as we talked about in part 1, administrative agencies are given substantial discretion, but also deference in performing their job and their functions. I would describe this as agencies tend to have a very narrow scope of authority. Obviously, with the Board of Pharmacy, their scope of authority is limited to the area of pharmacy. But within that narrow scope, they have a lot of discretion and they are given a lot of deference. The idea being, we view you as experts in your field. And when I say we, I'm speaking about courts, judges that are reviewing the work of an agency after the fact. And this could be in a litigation proceeding, an appeal of agency action, something like that. The idea from a court's perspective is you are experts in your field, so we are going to have a very high bar before we intervene and disturb your prior rulings, decisions, actions, because we believe that you're the experts. And who are we to interfere with that? I talked briefly last time about Chevron deference. Again, Chevron deference is a reference to a Supreme Court of the United States case from the mid-'80s, which established this idea of giving great deference to administrative agencies. And so the practical reality after many, many years of case law at both the federal and state level is that once an administrative agency, in this context, a board of pharmacy, has acted, the ability to challenge that board of pharmacy's action is extremely limited. Again, the idea is you're experts in the field. Who are we to disturb your decisions, your actions, or other orders that you may have entered or acted on? And we're only going to do it if you really messed up. And we talked about the framework for that. The 4-part framework is, and again, this would arise in the context of an individual or an entity is a party to a decision or an action or an order entered by a state board of pharmacy, they strongly disagree with it, and therefore they appeal it and they seek a ruling from a court that's reviewing the decision, overturning the decision, or otherwise vacating the decision. The framework for that is arguing that the decision was not supported by substantial evidence, that it was arbitrary or capricious, that the Board of Pharmacy acted beyond the scope or their powers as a Board of Pharmacy, or that somehow they violated a constitutional right. And a reminder here, these are very high legal burdens to establish. And then just a reminder of some of the common actions that we discussed. Very common actions include failures to notify or report. These are things that I would describe as failures to report or notify basic changes, change of location, a change of personnel, pharmacist in charge or supervising pharmacist. Failure to report disciplinary action in perhaps another state that you're licensed in. Next common action, failure to operate. The idea obtained your pharmacy license, but did not fully open your doors and become operational within a reasonable time period after you got the license. And then the final one we discussed was failure to supervise or inadequate supervision. And then a reminder of one of the practical tips coming from the first webinar, and that practical tip was being proactive with your Board of Pharmacy. And I just want to remind you of the importance of that. And you'll see this take shape as we talk more today. Really important to be proactive. And it's because of everything I just said. Given the high level of deference that is given to boards of pharmacy, you want to focus on preventing the board from taking action that is adverse to your interests. You want to prevent discipline. You want to prevent having to have inspectors come to your pharmacy. Now, in many ways, that is inevitable because there are mandatory visits. If you change your location, you're going to be visited by an inspector, as you should be. What we want to try to avoid are the unnecessary visits. Visits arising from customer complaints, visits arising from complaints from third-party payers, those sorts of things. And I always add to this, the concerned citizen, the individual who's kind of keeping an eye on the local business and finds new pharmacy is supposed to be opening up, but it's been 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and they're still not open. Why is that? People submit these complaints, and it does happen. So again, develop an attitude or a mentality of being proactive. So after that reminder on the tip from part 1 of the webinar, I want to move right into the second tip, and that is communicate with the Board of Pharmacy. And these two directly correlate. The reason why communication is so important is because it is probably one of the most proactive things you can do, but it is also one of the most preventative measures that you can take. I have this quote from Ben Franklin, which is one of the many that I subscribe to, the idea that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I just have to note here that when I was putting this together, I was adamant that one of these presentations be called an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And I was reminded by my wonderful colleagues here that that is a horrible idea for a webinar title, a little clunky, but I had to fit it in here somehow. It was Ben Franklin that said that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That is so true in this space. The reason for that is because even for minor infractions, almost always or almost all action taken by a Board of Pharmacy is both public and recorded as disciplinary action. And once that action becomes both public and disciplinary in nature, it likely becomes reportable to every payer that you have a contract with. I've seen the contracts. I've seen the credentialing applications. I've seen the re-credentialing applications. Every single one of them asks whether you have been subject to disciplinary action by a state board of pharmacy or other governmental authority. In my experience, there's no way to skirt that question. I would also say in many occasions, those questions are framed in a way where they want to know about it regardless of the ultimate outcome. Meaning, even if you had what you would describe or characterize as a very favorable outcome, just the fact that the action was even initiated needs to be reported. The same is true with other state boards of pharmacy. And again, this will likely only apply if you're licensed in more than one state, but pretty much every single state will require either affirmative reporting of disciplinary action or, and what I mean by affirmative is upon the occurrence of it, you must report it within a specified period of time. The alternative is at a time of renewing your license. So that could be annually, biannually, something like that. But again, you're likely not going to be able to skirt that. So knowing that, you want to focus on prevention, not the idea that I have a plan of action in place, that if I am ever subject to disciplinary action, I'm going to defend it vigorously. That's the wrong approach. We want to talk about prevention. As we're going to talk about different types of communication. But I note here, one basic one is that idea of reporting. Goes back to themes from the first part. But here, anytime you have to report something, whether it's disciplinary action, whether it's a change, you always want to be the one making the report. You don't want to be responding to an inquiry. Why? When you're proactively reporting, you control the narrative. That is especially important when you are reporting something that, may be a little uncomfortable to report. So what other types of communication are there? And when should you be communicating with your board of pharmacy? First one, when you have a question, communicate with your board of pharmacy. The question could be very simple. Now we'll talk about some different ways you might get the question answered. But if you have a question and you don't know the answer and you think it's important, reach out to your board of pharmacy. If you're not comfortable doing it, find someone that is. The recommendation would be hire an attorney. But I would say for a large percentage of questions you have, you should feel comfortable reaching out. When you have a concern, you should reach out to the board. And how is that different than just having a question? Well, you might just be concerned about something that happened. Perhaps you had an odd interaction with a customer and you're concerned that customer might make a complaint. Get ahead of it. Maybe contact the board of pharmacy and say, I want to document this situation with you because it just didn't sit right with me. I had a customer come in, they seemed upset, they had a valid prescription, we dispensed the medication, something just didn't feel right. I would just like to document that I have a concern about it. So there's a record of it if this individual does submit a complaint. That's one example. Another concern could be something much less concerning. It could be, I'm changing my hours. Now we all know that changes in hours, especially significant changes to hours, do need to be reported. But if you have a concern and you're not totally sure what to do, contact the board of pharmacy. And then I would say when something that happens that has or might impact your pharmacy. Examples of that usually go to dealing with different types of, natural disasters, impact from weather. I've seen the best examples are tornadoes, floods, hurricanes, those types of things. Could also be power outages. But anytime you think that something's going to impact the pharmacy, again, there's usually clear express reporting obligations associated with these things. But let's assume you don't know that. Communicate with the board. And then, of course, reminder, reporting obligations. And reporting is not just disciplinary, it's also changes. So what are the different ways that you can communicate with your board of pharmacy in an effective manner? You can do it by phone, you can do it by email, and you can do it in person. I would also tell you, all of these ways are effective ways of communication. And the one I would carve out here and maybe put an asterisk next to is phone, because I think a lot of people believe that in 2023, nobody's going to answer the phone at a board of pharmacy if you call them. I have actually found that is not the case at all. I have found in contacting a board of pharmacy, they're actually very responsive by phone. And we'll talk in a little more detail about that. Different information sources that are available that can be a great starting point. If you have a question, if it's important for you to get the answer right away, you should just call the board of pharmacy. But if you've got some time, pretty much every single board of pharmacy maintains very extensive and detailed frequently asked questions. I have often been surprised how extensive these frequently asked questions are for some of the different boards of pharmacy. I have found them to be one of the most helpful resources for addressing different circumstances. At minimum, they are a great starting point. If they don't have the exact answer to your question, I think you'll usually at least find something there that is going to get you started and lead you in the right direction. The other thing is it's kind of addition by subtraction. If something's not in the frequently asked questions, I would say you should then feel very empowered to reach out directly to your board of pharmacy via phone or email and ask your question. Next, a reminder that boards of pharmacy maintain very detailed contact lists. I have found that typically most boards of pharmacy are going to have different individual contacts or departments for different types of questions. It might be a specific department for licensing issues. It might be a different department for other types of issues. And then pretty much every board of pharmacy maintains a general questions contact, someone that you can reach out to. It'd either be a phone number, an email, or both for general inquiries that don't fall into a specific predetermined category. Again, use these resources, the emails, and especially the phone numbers. Real people typically answer. If you're already aware of that, then you're saying, Lucas, that's not news to me. Not so impressed by that little nugget of information. But I will tell you, there was a time where when I was first starting in this work, I didn't call boards of pharmacy because I thought no one was going to answer. Why would I think that? Because that's a norm in 2023. I've spoken to multiple different boards of pharmacy throughout the country, and it's in those moments where I've got an issue where there's no, and this is coming from someone who has ready access to very extensive databases where I can look up cases, different questions, ready access to all the different frequently asked questions. But I'm often surprised, and I think it's part of what I enjoy about doing this work is I'm usually hit with the question where there's not a clear answer. And I've called the board of pharmacy directly and spoken with someone who was more than happy to help me. And I've often been surprised at the types of responses I've gotten, which is, hold on, I'm not sure, I don't know the answer. Let me speak with my colleague real quickly. I'm going to put you on hold. They'll come back and say, oh, I just spoke with my colleague. Here's what we think, but we also think that you should confirm, so on and so forth. And if you can't find a clear answer, please send us an email. We'll look into it further. And oh, by the way, that way your client will have documented that you were looking into this. It is really, really thorough responses, and they take this very seriously. Another example, call, ask a question. I don't know the answer. I'm going to check. Let me give you a call back. Can I have your name and number? Sure enough, usually within 24 hours, I get a call back. The point I'm trying to make here is these are very responsive individuals and personnel that take the job seriously working at the boards of pharmacy. So take advantage of them as a resource. In many ways, they're there for you just as much as they're there for the public and the residents that they serve. And then the last thing I would note is boards of pharmacy, and again, another form of communication, again, this is going one direction, it's coming from the board to you as a licensee, is sometimes issuing advisory opinions, guidance, or other types of notifications. Now, I want to mention that this kind of arose during the last webinar because someone had asked a question on this exact topic. So I'll get into a little more detail about that. So a little more detail on the idea of frequently asked questions. Just wanted to give you some examples. In Texas, a sample frequently asked question. When am I required to supply requested records to the board? Answer. Pharmacy records must be supplied within 72 hours of the request. What comes right after that? A citation. I point this out because it's a real question. You might have a request from a board of pharmacy, here, the Texas Board of Pharmacy, for records. You might get nervous. Am I being investigated? Do I have to provide these records? If you have any doubt, that answer is about as clear as it gets. Pharmacy records must be supplied within 72 hours of the request. Now, I recommend, especially if you're a Texas pharmacy, look at these frequently asked questions. They have a lot of detail. I excerpted here just the clear-cut answer, but there's actually more information contained in the full PDF of the frequently asked questions. In addition, they're citing you right to the statute where this requirement's contained. I have dealt with this issue, on this very specific issue, on multiple occasions, which is a records request made by a Board of Pharmacy inspector, and the pharmacy's nervous, perhaps doesn't want to supply the records, not because they're hiding anything, but just because it feels uncomfortable. Do I have to do this? Yes, you do. And what happens if you don't supply the records in 72 hours? Even if you provide them at a later date, you could be subject to disciplinary action for not providing the records within 72 hours. So it's not okay, and it's not enough to provide them in 73 hours or 75 hours. You need to get them there within that 72-hour time frame. So I kind of look at this as analogous to the reporting disciplinary action. A lot of times people don't want to report it. Why? Because they're afraid they're opening a can of worms, and it's just going to become the beginning of additional disciplinary action. And you may be right, but by reporting it, you're mitigating. Here, by providing records, even if you're concerned about what you're providing, you eliminate not an allegation of non-compliance with the request. Now, I want to be clear. If you have concern, you should always seek legal counsel. And the types of concerns I want to suggest that I'm speaking to are in Texas. This could be as simple as trying to assess whether the pharmacy was open and operational during that 6-month period of time after they obtained their license. And they may know, I'm not operational. And if they look at these records, they're going to find that out. The best way to deal with that is to take it head on. And so that's why I recommend seeking legal counsel. But that's one example of a clear answer contained in frequently asked questions. Next example, Oklahoma. What are the Oklahoma licensing requirements for non-resident pharmacies and facilities? The answer is, and this is slightly paraphrased, if you're a non-resident pharmacy, you got to be licensed in your home state. You need to have a pharmacist in charge who's licensed in Oklahoma. And you need to have been inspected in the last 2 years by your home board of pharmacy or another approved organization. Now, there's a few other requirements in that, but those are really the high points. The one thing that I would note that's interesting there is note that you don't have to, the pharmacy, according to this, does not have to be licensed in the state of Oklahoma, but your pharmacist in charge does need to be licensed in the state of Oklahoma. So that's somewhat unique, but again, that's readily available information through the frequently asked questions. And then here, a final example from Virginia. And this goes back to that idea of supervising or an allegation of a lack of supervision. If a pharmacist is not physically present in the prescription department, does the prescription department have to be locked and alarmed? Notice it says in parentheses, helping a patient, taking a break, etc. It goes back to that idea of, I'll be right back, no problem, right? Maybe. The answer here couldn't be clearer. No one can be present in the prescription department of a pharmacy, and that prescription department must be locked and alarmed unless a pharmacist is on duty. I would say another answer that could have just been yes. The idea is, I think when you look at these, you can see that the board is not pulling any punches. They're not giving, unclear answers to these questions. Why review the frequently asked questions with your board of pharmacy? Reminder, it's a form of communication. It may be only moving in one direction. It's coming from the board to you, but it's a form of the communication. In addition, if something is memorialized in a frequently asked question by the board of pharmacy, first, it's just that. It's frequently asked. If a lot of people are asking it, it probably means the board has observed that it's an issue, a trend, or some sort of a cause for concern. And then I would say it's the combination. So you can learn a lot from the frequently asked questions and the responses by trends that the board is seeing. The other thing you can derive from it is types of conduct and practices that the board is paying attention to and focused on. So, I talked about allegations of failure to operate. If you go to the frequently asked questions for many state boards of pharmacy, you're going to find frequently asked questions about those obligations. It means two things. They're getting a lot of questions about it, and they're probably monitoring and policing that. Reviewing the frequently asked questions is a prime example of proactive measures and conduct. Next, talking about BOP contact lists and information. Again, I want to go back and I want to encourage you to use this. So starting point may be the frequently asked questions, and I always encourage that as a starting point. But you're going to find that there's questions where you don't have a clear answer, or you may not have the time to sit down and review all those documents. So I've just excerpted here some of the readily available contact information. And I just point this out because I think the fact that you have these phone numbers readily available, you have these email addresses readily available, it shows that they welcome these inquiries. So, question that I've received in the past, recommendations for a pharmacy that would like to obtain board input on a particular topic before taking action. I had this question come as a result of the last webinar. Use the BOP's contact lists and reach out, call them, email them. I do recommend the call first. It may seem a little old-fashioned, but the reason why is I have found that when you can talk to someone, it really allows you to frame the issue or the concern or the question you have in very practical terms. And sometimes sitting down and writing out an email, sometimes it just doesn't come out right. So I think a great starting point is to call someone. If you either don't get a hold of someone or you talk to someone and they don't have the answer, send a follow-up email. The other thing I would always say is the email is the great 1-2 punch with a phone call. If you call about a question and let's say you get an answer, follow up with an email and send it to your board of pharmacy as a thank you, but also as a confirmation, as documentation of the fact that you made the inquiry and got an answer. Dear Board of Pharmacy personnel, username, Dear Lucas, I wanted to thank you again for your time earlier today to discuss and answer my question. I really appreciate your answer. Just to confirm, you advised during the call that I am permitted to change my hours, but if I do so, I need to post a sign reflecting exactly what the new hours are and when they will take effect, and if they will end, when they will end. Thank you, I appreciate this. Let's say the person you talk to happened to get it wrong. Or there's some sort of a miscommunication. An inspector later comes and is there and finds that you were temporarily closed during the hours of 12 to 1 p.m. for 3 days a week in the month of May. And it was because you all of a sudden had a new obligation related to your children's school. So you made that change. You posted it. You played by the rules as you were told. And they still say that somehow you didn't comply with the rules by properly posting them, or that you had one additional obligation. If you can point back to that email and you can show that you reached out with your question, got a clear answer, and documented it, there is a very good chance, although I certainly can't guarantee it, that even if you perhaps got wrong information, the fact that you, one, reached out, two, were given an answer, and three, complied with the answer you were given and documented that and can show that action, if it was initiated, there's a good chance it will be dismissed entirely, which I will tell you, it's very rare that you can obtain that type of a result. It is also the best result you can get under these types of scenarios. I've had those types of circumstances arise where we've had documentary proof that the Board of Pharmacy representative answered a question, said X, Y, and Z. The pharmacy complied with what was provided, wasn't entirely correct, but because there was what we would describe as substantial compliance and a good faith effort to address the issue, the Board of Pharmacy has saw fit to dismiss an action entirely after it was initiated. Now, I want to circle back briefly to the first webinar, and I kind of previewed this, and that's because during the first webinar, I got a question, which was, and this is the exact question, is it typical for a Board of Pharmacy to provide an advisory opinion on a particular topic? And my response at that time was, it happens, but it's kind of rare. Board of Pharmacies do occasionally issue advisory opinions. You might call it guidance or some sort of clarification. When this happens, and my answer here is advisory opinions are not necessarily typical or common, but BOPs will sometimes issue advisory opinions or other guidance or clarification for specified issues. It is rare. And I actually went back and looked at this because, of course, I wanted to make sure I was, providing correct information. And I think that's about a perfect response. And the reason why I say that is because in going back and reviewing some of the different advisory opinions, they are actually very, very rare. But the flip side of that is when it happens, pay very close attention, knowing that it's rare. If it happens, that means the Board of Pharmacy is taking the time to put together this rare piece of an advisory opinion or guidance. So it probably means there's been an issue and they're trying to help you out or get ahead of the issue. A couple examples. In New York, if you go to their website, I think right now you're going to see two posted advisory opinions. One is going to be guidance regarding COVID-19 vaccines, and the other one is going to be this advisory notice on automated dispensing machines. I'm just going to read it real quick to make one point. The New York State Department of Education has been made aware that pharmacy establishments have installed automated dispensing machines that store and provide prescription drugs for sale to customers outside of their respective registered pharmacy areas. The advisory opinion says the department considers this to be a violation of state law. Well, this may be a very narrow issue, but if you had any questions as to whether this conduct constituted an issue for the Board of Pharmacy, kind of hard to hide from it after you read that. The department considers this to be a violation of state law. So talk about an advisory opinion, something very specific, and they have spoken on the issue. By the way, I would just add, yes, New York houses its oversight of pharmacies within the Department of Education. In Minnesota, I found a good example where Minnesota issued guidance concerning approval of telepharmacies. I won't get into the details, but it's pretty easy to find. If you're a Minnesota pharmacy and you have a question on that, it's readily available. But I think that topic there reflects they were getting a lot of inquiries about telepharmacies. And I think they were also probably noticing an increase in trends or concerns regarding telepharmacy. And I will just say, based on my own experience as well, that is an area that I think there's a lot of increase in telepharmacy, period. But it's also an area that's heavily scrutinized. And then just to add one final example, Oregon. And I think this helps to illustrate how rare it is that boards of pharmacy issue advisory opinions. Since 2014, the Oregon Board of Pharmacy issued just 3 position statements. And again, I would say position statements is the parlance that Oregon uses for advisory opinions. 3 of them, February 2022, February 2018, August 2014. So does it happen? Yes, but it is rare. But the takeaway, check your Board of Pharmacy website. If they've got one, you should know it because they put the time into it. It means it's an issue. Now, BOPs, you probably all know this, they conduct regular meetings. But what a lot of people may not know is that they're public proceedings. Most of these can be attended. I've attended many of them. Really easy when they're virtual. By the way, when I say I've attended all of them, yes, I've been there with clients, but I've also been there just as a fly on the wall. Why? Because I have found they are one of the best ways to learn about what is going on in the state. What are the current concerns, the current issues facing the Board of Pharmacy? How do they intend to rule on them? I remember the first time that I attended a Board of Pharmacy meeting, I was sitting there and I was actually thinking to myself, I cannot believe the amount of information that I am learning just sitting here in this one meeting, and how open and freely the board members were discussing issues and concerns. And by the way, I mean that in a complimentary way. These are not secret meetings that are held in the dark of night. They're held, it's the exact opposite. They're a public government agency. They're held in the light of day and they're public for a reason. They want people to know what's going on and they want people to learn from the meetings. And I think I walked away from that first Board of Pharmacy meeting, one, knowing issues that were of concern in that state. I also knew what the Board of Pharmacy was discussing as possible solutions. They talked openly about certain rules they were considering implementing in the state to address the issues and the concerns that they heard or had, I should say, had learned about or had. And so I knew right away, for any clients that are doing business in this particular state, I want to communicate with them because they need to be aware that there's this concern by the board and that they're considering taking action to address it and what that might be. The other thing I would say is you'll often hear people say it's not what you know, it's who you know. And while I think there's definitely some truth to that, it does matter what you know, especially in the practice of pharmacy. But if there's any way to get to know your Board of Pharmacy members, it's by attending these meetings because they're usually there. If they're not all there, the majority of them are going to be there, but usually most of them are attending these meetings. And there's nothing wrong with introducing yourself, especially for those that are conducted in person. Many of these are still conducted virtually, but at minimum, you can learn who the players are. So if you've never attended one, I would encourage you, and I know it takes time. It may seem uncomfortable, but I also think if you're going to choose pharmacy as your profession, you're going to be a pharmacist, you're going to own a pharmacy or both. It is possible in the span of a 20, 30, 40, 50-year career that you may face disciplinary action. Knowing that that's possible, don't let the first time you attend a Board of Pharmacy meeting be because you are a respondent in a Board of Pharmacy action. Let the first time you go there, and hopefully the last time, be as someone who's just a participant and wanted to observe the proceeding. So continuing with the idea of developing a positive relationship with state boards of pharmacy. And again, I think this idea of communication goes a long way in that. If you communicate with them, you become more of a familiar face. Again, be proactive, communicate with the board, and to the extent possible, be involved with the board. See if there's any ways that you can become involved beyond just attending a meeting. If you see those opportunities, I encourage you to take advantage of them. And then a third tip here, and again, this goes to the idea of communication, it goes to the idea of being proactive, and it goes to the idea of developing a positive relationship. Know your board or boards of pharmacy's mission. Every board of pharmacy has a mission statement. The reason why I say this, and I think this often gets overlooked, and it may even be perceived as a little cheesy, because sometimes those mission statements may just seem like boilerplate language, but I found that there's actually a lot to them. It's an example of being proactive. This is probably the most important thing. It helps you to gain an understanding of the perspective that a board of pharmacy has when they're interacting with you. And I think when you see the way the mission is written, you're going to see that kind of the North Star for a board of pharmacy is protecting the residents of their state. And so if you know that, and you're kind of also letting that be your North Star, I think you're going to find, one, you probably avoid a lot of issues with the board of pharmacy, but I think you're also going to find that you're cultivating a relationship with the board of pharmacy that's built on mutual respect for one another, with two entities or parties trying to achieve the same goal, which is take care of your patients and their state residents. And then finally, maybe I describe this as the second most important thing, is knowing the mission and being able to reflect this in how you run your pharmacy operation. It reflects accountability. And that is probably one of the most important things that I hear board of pharmacy members talk about is accountability. The idea that not everything's always going to go right, but when something goes wrong, we want to know that you're going to step up and address the issue, take the issue seriously. One of the most common questions that I get when I am representing a client in a board of pharmacy action is, Lucas, do I need to attend that with you? And my response is always, you don't have to attend, but I really recommend that you do attend. And again, it's because of accountability. I've had board members and attorneys say right to me, we want them there because we want to know that they're accountable. And so if I talk about accountability, it's because I've heard it directly from the different boards that I've worked with. So just a couple of the examples of mission statements. This is from Minnesota. The Minnesota Board of Pharmacy exists to promote, preserve, and protect the public health, safety, and welfare by fostering the safe distribution of pharmaceuticals and the provision of quality pharmaceutical care to the citizens of Minnesota. So if you think about them looking at your pharmacy or your pharmacist's license through that lens, I think that can help you to think about steps you can take to reflect that you're doing the same. Oregon. The Oregon Board of Pharmacy serves to promote and protect public health, safety, and welfare by ensuring high standards in the practice of pharmacy and through effective regulation of the manufacture and distribution of drugs. Key there, ensuring high standards. If they're going to have high standards, you should also have high standards. Have good policies and procedures in place. Account for those unexpected things. Quick example of that. Have a sign that you've prepared that is extremely detailed in the event you have an emergency and you have to leave your pharmacy unexpectedly. You should have a sign readily available that you can put on the front desk, the front door, and anywhere else you can think of within reason. If you have that emergency where you have to leave the pharmacy unexpectedly on a temporary basis. The pharmacy is temporarily closed due to an emergency. The pharmacist will return as soon as possible. In the event of an emergency, please call the following number or 911, something like that. By the way, I just want to be clear. Don't rely on what I just said. That is a high general paraphrase of some of the obligations in a particular state. Always confirm your precise obligations with your state or consult with an attorney. But you get the idea. Plan for the unexpected. Finally, in Oregon, they also have a list of other different kind of pillars, if you will. Values, quality, safety, integrity, professionalism. And the last one I wanted to mention here is just that, again, that idea of accountability. I think that's one of the most consistent things that I see with boards of pharmacy is the idea of working with individuals and businesses that are accountable. And you see in that asterisks, trust, responsibility, transparency. And then Texas State Board of Pharmacy, as a leader in protecting the public health of the citizens of Texas, shall uphold quality standards for licensing and facilitate regulation that promotes innovative, multidisciplinary, and collaborative practices in education which produce quality care and positive patient outcomes. I did receive a few questions, and I'll be brief on this, and to the extent I don't get through all of them, I will address these at the beginning of the final webinar in this series. But one question I did want to answer is, how frequently should a pharmacist or a pharmacy reach out to the Board of Pharmacy with general inquiries or for updates on compliance requirements? My answer to that is be reasonable. I do kind of want to give a little bit of the mention that you don't want to pester them. So I would reserve this for questions that you're kind of stumped on, that don't have a readily available answer, or that you've looked and can't find the answer. The exception there would be if you just need a quick answer and you don't have time to sit down and do the research, call. I would just say this isn't something where you want to be that individual that's calling 2 or 3 times a day. And I think that all makes sense to everyone. So use kind of common sense and reason as a good baseline. And I do have a few other questions, but I'll tell you what, because we're coming up on the hour, I do want to kind of wrap it up. So I would just end with 2 reminders. One is part 3 of the webinar series, which will also be the final part of this webinar series, is May 10th. 2023. That's going to be navigating Board of Pharmacy actions. And so we're going to shift gears there. This has been about what are some common actions, trying to prevent those actions from occurring. We're going to now pick up the 3rd webinar. We'll do a quick review of part 1 and 2, but we're going to be then addressing the situation where you are now a party to a disciplinary action and some tips on navigating that. So again, that is May 10th. That is also a Wednesday, just like this one and the first one. And then just a final reminder, when I ended the first webinar, I was letting you know that John Levitt, one of the co-founding partners here at Frier Levitt, was going to be testifying before the United States Senate Committee on Finance. That has now occurred. For those of you who didn't have a chance to watch it, I would encourage you to watch it. That is available. You can view that, and it's very easy to access through the Senate Finance Committee's website. And I would just say that for pharmacists and pharmacy owners, especially independent pharmacies, the subject matter that was discussed during that hearing is very relevant. If you have any questions about that or any aspect of this webinar, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I had a lot of you reach out following part 1 of the webinar, and it was really great to be able to interact with you. And I'm happy to do that. You can call me or email me, and I'm happy to respond. So thank you all for attending, and I look forward to the final webinar in this series.